بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين. My students, welcome to your or to the third class of American Lit. I know today, we are going on, in our, lecturing system of introducing you to American Lit. I assigned you 50 pages if you think last week. Yes. So I'm sure you responded to them. The model will be ready this week, hopefully, so you can post your response easily. So let's start by the response, and then we have a discussion, a general discussion about what you have read. Okay? Yes. Who's ready to come to read?
Yes.
Yes, Isra, please.
They were convinced that all what was happening was merely God's own plan, and they were the prophets who showed tirelessly well to achieve the mission. Sermons, diaries, biographies, and autobiographies were the main genres at the beginning, used to make others sympathize with the new mission. Therefore, the play style and structure were very important to make their literature readable. Step by step, the first settlers brought a printing press from Britain to exceed the boundaries and soon the world. The insistence on building a new world made the settlers overcome all difficult conditions, including harsh weather, lack of necessities, and conflict with Indians whose land the English had usurped and continued usurping. It is totally astonishing when one reads such a confession from those English. Even their literature gave its witness as the main genre became colonial in tone. Most American publications of the 17th century were written by Puritans and frequently concerned religious topics. However, in the 18th century, it started to be secular urban. The influence of religion retreated and the Enlightenment ideas of England came to influence. They were influenced by Alexander Pope, thus they started using the heroic couplet. Furthermore, John Donne and his conceit were used. As the century progressed and a revolutionary spirit grew, America wrote political poems. Even drama performances were an exception, but drama performances were an exception. They were only presented in the South and were popular there. By 1770s, several plays were published as the revolution approached. Regarding the main factors that make the historical style change, be purely literary, I.A. Richard and Ransom's publications were the main motives. Both the new criticism and practical criticism called for a revival of the aesthetic notions. But in a nutshell, the American literature in its difficult stages was merely a reflection of the historical, social, and even colonial changes.
Okay, thank you for this entire thorough response. It seems like she has gone through the reading meticulously, and she has grasped the spirit of the whole chapter. Yes, American literature, was born. Yet it took a long time, or almost 3 centuries to become American. And we are studying the colonial period because even though this colonial period was devoid of any purely American, and again we have to delineate what is purely American later. But as I said in previous classes, it's very important to have a look at the colonial writings and publications, because in those writings you could see the origins of many later characteristics of American literature. Okay, now I would to listen from other people. How did you find the reading this week? Yes? And what did you get out of the reading?
I'm gonna first of all say that America, or the book started that America established by getting many immigrants from Europe. It mentioned many countries like Holland, Spanish, British.
So the English were not the
Were
only
not the only,
people
yes.
who were involved
Yes.
in, you know, the
Yes.
exploration
The
project.
first city established there was, I think, Jamestown.
Jamestown, yeah.
Jamestown, and firstly the culture started to raise or to be arose in Massachusetts when many cultures were there together,
Mhm.
and they tried to get their identity in
Mhm.
this land.
Yeah, there was like, you know, an urge to know who you are.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. For the religious aspects of that period, they started to get rid of being totally religious, although the first pieces were sermons and.
So we want to say like
they started,
Puritans did not last, you know, yes, the
Yes.
Puritans, they had
started to be
their
secular
upper
as well.
word, they had their grip, you know. However, like the Puritans did not last for long time. It
Yes.
lasted for almost 70 years. You know. Okay, good. Yes, other, yes, Taj.
Okay, when I first did about the colonial literature in general, I hate the word colonies.
Yes.
Colonial. So I was disgusted from the beginning.
But I like, you know, what she said, confessional literature. This is like confessional.
Yes.
Because the colonialists were writing confession of their, you know, something confessional literature.
So it was in everything in our life that it is always the religious motives that motivate us to go somewhere.
So you don't like, you know, this mask, like, yes, I'm going to
so
civilize
it was hidden
people.
by, it was
I'm
hidden by
going-
the religious thing.
Mhm.
But I wasn't interested in all the history, but the thing that grabbed my attention is that how is it like the colonial itself, the bad things that happening to others creates some kind of literature.
Mhm.
And then the thing that I was interested in is that when literature moved from being historical to being like kind of literature, just
Yeah.
literature for arts sake.
Yeah, and I think literature was like a kind of media machine of
Yes,
that time
yeah.
because, you know,
Like
the absence
preaching.
of media. Nowadays we have the media, so we can, you know, everything can be promulgated easily. But if you go back to 500 or 600 years, we needed like some media, we need some means of communication to convey the message. And I think, you know, those people wanted to, you know, communicate, to spread their messages, and the only venue which was available for them was literature, you know, in different forms.
Yeah,
Okay.
everyone likes literature.
Yes.
Well, I want to say that while going through the pages, one thing grabbed my attention that everything reminds me of the art while establishing Israel in Palestine. The writing about Jerusalem and how they write about
so this
country they don't
transcendental,
know.
you know, this transcendental, this platonic, you know,
Yes.
dream of establishing
A new
a holy
world.
city. So
Yes.
you like try to compare
Yeah,
between the founding of America and the founding of Israel.
yeah.
Okay.
And I think it has some similarities between them. Similarities while writing about the America. It was a land that they don't know, and they wrote about that it is an ideal land, but they don't know what is.
Yeah.
America.
So like, you know, romanticizing
Yeah.
the you know, like the colonized land was you know, part of the ideology of the colonizer, you know.
Land of opportunity.
Like to romanticize and to demonize the people because, you know, you romanticize you know, the country and you demonize the people. The same happened like,
Here.
you know, in America, and the same, you know, was happening in Palestine because, you know, I mean, they've been telling, yeah, come to the this holy land, the land of milk and the land of honey, you know, where people are here, you know, vulgar, devilish, you know,
Civilization.
terrorists and so on, you know. So it's the same colonial, you know, ideology. Okay, so it resonates to you. Yes?
Actually, it fascinated me that we were reading about the history of America, and then we realized, like step by step, that America is the first enemy of history,
Mhm.
because this land, they like was like a dream for them, and it was inhabited by other people, which are the
So
who are
they,
the Indians.
their dream was not a legal dream, you know,
Yes,
because
they wanted
they
to
dream,
build,
they had a dream to, you know, live in a land which was
Yeah.
not theirs, you know.
And
This is
they-
what you want to say.
yes, and they wanted to build their own history, like over the shoulders of an
But don't
existing
forget
history.
that they came, you know, because they thought that God wanted them, you know, to go there. God wanted them to convert, and this is what they said. You know?
This is what they said, but this is not the truth, or this is just like a justification for, we want to
Their
be
colonial.
there. Yes.
Okay. It's very important, like, you know, you talk, because I think what you're telling me, it reveals, you know, that you have read. And of course, this means like, you know, I will give you your participation marks. Those who are silent will not take in their participation marks. See, I'm telling you. Okay? So train yourself to read, to participate. Okay? Do we have a further comment before we start?
Their social life, they kept on the slavery that was originally in Europe, and also being masculine society. They also kept this outside shape of their society. Women were not.
Yeah, so you're talking about a
participants.
society which was racist, you
Yes.
know? Like,
Of course.
and you know, there is a whole nation that America was built on a great guilt,
Yes.
you know?
Great sin.
Great sin.
Great lie.
Okay.
also.
Good. So let me start by showing you a quick clip. It's a long video, in fact, but you know, it's like an introduction to the.
In the beginning, the land of the North American continent was inhabited by a strong-willed civilization of people now known to us as Native American Indians. Then from across the pond, sent by rulers and monarchs in search of fantastic riches beyond the imagination, there came white people. The conflict between the Native American Indians and the white people, and eventually between the white people and their native countries, resulted in the birth of a new nation. A nation that began to record its narrative in letters and songs and poetry. Stories that would resound from that time on. Stories that would be studied by millions of high school students who would often rather go to sleep. Stories that would be known as American myths.
Something mythical, isn't it? Let's get this far.
They were handed down in the spoken word as part of something we call the oral tradition. Get your mind out of the gutter, you filth. Yeah, baby. Now, time in America. The hell! Focus on two things: prayer and work, and you'll be fine. So, there you go. If you didn't mind hard work, and you could go without smiling, dancing, lusting, or drinks, epidemics broke out, sicknesses killed thousands, and then people fled back to drinks. Epidemics broke out, sicknesses killed thousands, and then people fled back to nature. Time for a quick bit of review. And yearned for a return to nature. So many loaded their proverbial 19th century SUVs and sallied forth into the great beyond. This return to nature is known in American lit as the Romantic Age. A good friend of mine once said, you can define romantic literature using this.
Okay. It's very interesting, like you watch this, like how America, it started like by a myth, by a dream, and how it became the most sovereign and the most powerful country in the world. As we said, like the forming of the nation, needed some kind of literature of its own. Today, we are going to continue the story of founding America, but we are going to be more specific about, literature. So again, this is the third, as I told you, the third lecture. So as you see here, we have colonial literature. We're talking about like this part of the reading you are having, the boundaries of the period. Why study this period and these writers? Because some people who teach American literature, they exclude, the colonial period thinking that it doesn't have any important or any, literature which can be dubbed as literature. I think, they are mistaken because, as we said in previous lectures, the colonial period, you could say it has the origins of, what is now called American literature. We're going to have a look about the movements and the schools, active during the period, the dominant genres and literary forms, dominant writers, historical and social contexts, key historical events of the period, and major issues, and perhaps development with publishing, that affected, the writing. I know the presentation is like very long, but, we are going to go through these things quickly. Okay, as you see here, the colonial period extends from 1607 to 1776. And these two dates are very important because the first date, this span of time is, as I said, it's like 170 years. And, the first date is exactly the date of establishing Jamestown. Jamestown, which was, settled by the early, settlers. And we have also like, you have 1776. It is like the American, revolution against, let's say, Britain, the colonizing power. Okay, in fact, 1607, as we said, was a remarkable date because, it's the first time. It was like, space project nowadays, like many astronauts go to space, but they don't settle. It was the case with America, but 1607 was remarkable because, the English were the first to go and to settle there. And those people were like the settlers of Jamestown. It was Captain Christopher Newport. It was part of commercial project. This man was leading about 100 people. They settled in Jamestown. This little colony was led by John Smith, the leader, who was taken captive and, by, Indian or Native American tribes, the Pocahontas. They took him, and he narrated in a very exciting manner, like how those people were dealing with him. Then you have, this expansion, continued. John Smith, as we said, was writing, something about his experience. It was not easy for them because they had to fight the natural hardships and, also fighting with people, they had a lot of trouble by the Native American. Okay, we said the latest day is like when America declared its independence. And, I want to quote because, the Declaration of Independence is, again, a literary piece. Some teachers are teaching, the Declaration of Independence as a literary piece. Why? Because it is full of, fictional things. And, this is written by Thomas Jefferson. Of course, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal, station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Like that was, the beginning, the real beginning, of establishing a country with distinct identity. But between this, the many things happened. Of course, the colonization was still in process. Now, a question: why should we study this period? Again, as I said, it came first. It is like some people want to teach things in chronological order. They want to go from A to Z. They don't want to skip. It's not because of this, but as I said, because of the importance of period in stimulating, the features of American literatures, and perhaps in originating many of the motifs in American literature. The literature which was written during that period, even though it was mainly imitation, it anticipated many themes and motifs that would become exclusive to American literatures. And here I would, just like list some of these, like self-searching. It's a distinctive feature, like the questioning, lowliness, and perhaps the American dream itself. Because, as we said in the previous lecture, the early settlers came with the hope of establishing, a holy city upon the hill. And I think, this has to do with, the 19th century movement, which is called Transcendentalism. So Transcendentalism, the seeds of Transcendentalism are, there in, the Puritan dream of establishing a city upon the hill. The Puritans and their legacy, as I said, like the Puritan was very austere dogma. We talked about the Calvinistic principles last time, and how that, dogma led to despair, and how that dogma, did not tolerate any opposing faction, because those Puritans were very dogmatic, and even they were very strict. They thought that, God sent them to contend with the, devil and the opposing factions. And who were the opposing factions? They were, the Quakers, the Antinomians, like the Armenians, yes, and other people. So they were their rival sects. So they had to fight with them, and they had to fight with other people. So now I would say, like fighting, this dogma is characterized by its, let's say, great deal of intolerance. Like, you're not tolerant. You don't tolerate, like, let's say, mistakes or whatever, others. Like, you are full of revenge. And, I think, Hawthorne, the famous 19th century American writer who was a descendant of John Hawthorne, the one who was like the main, judge, one of the main judges in the witch trial, like criticized those Puritans and, showed how those Puritans were relentless in their revenge. They were not tolerant at all. So when we're talking about intolerance, which is unfortunately, a feature characteristic of, American, character, and it's still up to the present. Yes, the American people are very good. However, intolerance is there, and the idea of revenge is there. Perhaps this is, the Puritan legacy itself. Yes.
However, in the book, the colonial literature, the Puritans said that they did welcome all different faiths, like Quakers and Lutherans, Anglicans. So it was considered as the land of democracy.
Yeah.
However, their intention was like opposing these factors.
Yeah, they opposed. They wanted to impose their own,
beliefs and
Calvinistic,
dogmas.
and they did not tolerate any, different sect or any different faction. As I said, like this, period is very important because, we're talking about the American experience, and what makes literature is the experience itself. And like a lot of historians, a lot of critics think that, American literature starts, with the moment those early settlers started to acquire their experience on this land. So we spoke, if you remember, in the previous two lectures about the American literature, which preceded the discovery of America, and we didn't want to include that. Even we are not including, like the Native American literature. So we're talking about American literature from the period of colonialism. Okay, the encounter of the indigenous people, and how you report back about those battles, about how clashes and captivities. So it's very important because when you talk, when you write diaries or whenever, and you describe other people, you are trying to fictionalize, And as we said, colonialism or the colonial ideology is built on romanticizing the land and demonizing the people.
Yeah.
Perhaps this would be very important when we study, the narrative of captivity for Mary Rowlandson. Okay. The roots of the American dream, as we said, the roots of American dream, like in this period, because, the American dream, which is a motif of American literature, it is difficult to understand the American dream without understanding, the colonial period, because as we said in John Winthrop, in the model of Christian charity, like here, we are sent by God to build a city on the hill. This dream, this millenarian dream, however, did not continue to be purely spiritual. Later, it started the people were distracted by the abundance, the richness, the opulence of the land, and they started to forget about their early dream. And as I said, in the previous class, the dichotomy of the American dream here starts by being torn between spiritualism and materialism. This is very important because, in most of the texts we are going to study, the American dream will be either in the foreground or in the background. So it's very important to understand this right from the very beginning. Okay, as we said, this period started by the Puritans. However, the Puritans, did not, the grip of Puritans did not continue because of the other rising factions, the Puritans were forced to change, and there were some priests who came from England. They had their, emotional, appeal, and they started Puritanism as a way of life started to fade, and of course, Puritanism gave away to new philosophies like deism, rationalism, and what you call the Renaissance, not Renaissance, because we're not talking about a new birth, but we are talking about a birth of people. So we are talking about the awakening, the Renaissance, which happened just before the revolution itself. So it's very important to study because we are talking about a period which was detrimental, in demarcating, the benchmarks of American literature. If we're talking about the movements and schools active during the period, we're talking about the Puritans, both the Pilgrims and the Separatists. The Separatists, those who separated from the church, the Pilgrims, all of them saw themselves as pilgrims. God sent them, you know, to, to convert the indigenous people. God sent them to test their faith, to worship God and to purify, the Church of England. But it's very funny how they are going to purify the Church of England when they are away from England. But they had contacts with the mother, colonial power, which is England, because England had the upper hand, the English laws were there. As you see in 1662, there was the half-away covenant or agreement, and this covenant, is an example how those Puritans started to adapt themselves to the new reality, because they were unable to continue their, grip, their theology, so they had to adapt themselves. And I think by the end of the period, by the end of 17th century, Puritanism gave away to many, reformist movement. So they had to alter. The issue was inspired by declining church membership, which the Puritans attempted to reverse by offering partial membership to some people, though these semi-members were not permitted to receive the Lord's Supper. So there was some change. So they are not now dogmatic, in order to be a member of this church, you have to be a participant in the Last Supper, which is a biblical, reality. Though most Americans' publications of the 17th century were written by Puritans and frequently concerned religious, the new century brought a new worldview. So the writing even changed. Okay. Again, here we're talking about how, we're talking about Puritans in the North and the colonial period in the North. We're not talking about the South. The Puritans were very effective, but it doesn't mean that, there were, the South was not settled. The South was settled by, what I would say, by English people, but they were not Puritans. They were, Cavalier. They had, the royalist, culture, not the Republican. Because if we go back to England, England was divided in the 17th century between the Republicans, who toppled down the king, and the royalists who, the royalists who, were loyal to the king. So the South had different demographic people. They were mostly, open, more liberal, less dogmatic. They had, literature of their own. They had a culture of their own. Okay. Now the dominant genres of, the period, as you said in the response, mainly, the Bible was the first, as they say, the first, book, the Bible. And like the Bible, because, the Bible had a lot of narrative stories. The Bible is allegorical. Most of the writings, were affected by the Bible. And even those Puritans, used what is called typology. What is typology? You interpret whatever happens to you by, biblical, incidents. Yes, please.
They believe that to understand God, they have to understand the Bible. So they go through the Bible in order to understand the land, to be to make easy to establish their dream in this.
Part of it, to be to gain this perseverance, to gain this zeal, to continue.
But they were prevented from printing it in the new land. So the effect of religion started to be retreating.
Yes.
Okay. So as we said, the Bible was the first, book in America, and it influenced
the first source.
many writers. Yeah, it's the first literary book in America.
Yeah.
Those writers, it inspired the writers to write, mainly those who wrote the sermons, and the sermons were what? part of speeches given by ministers to strengthen, to, you know, they were oral and later they were written. They were full of rhetoric, you know, and very allegorical, you know.
Yeah.
Okay. The histories, you know, like they were writing histories, like John Smith, you know, and you know, other people. Diaries, they were writing diaries. Letters they were sending. Poetry, there was poetry. But poetry was religious and even, you know, non-religious because they were imitating. And we are talking about political satire, you know, poetry about love poetry, poetry about religious people, and so on. Biographies and autobiographies were also common. And those people, okay, yes, were partly imitation. However, you know, they encoded in them some American experience, and they encoded in them some, you know, themes which later become exclusive to American literature, and even some distinctive features. The drama, you know, drama was not there, you know. Shakespeare was being played in the South, you know. But like drama had to come like towards the, you know, like after, you know, the Independence Day. There are belletristic essays, and they were prominent. Some people like are teaching, you know, them like they were like essays written by, you know, Restoration period by Alexander Pope and John Dryden. Okay, so those were there to perhaps to articulate certain ideas about how, you know, to progress in this, you know, land, how to deal with other people. So they were very effective, and as you see, like there were some journals to continue those, you know, biographies. Dominant writers, like these dominant writers, John Winthrop, and like if you go to the YouTube and listen to John Winthrop, you could find that this is, you know, a piece of literature. Now I want, like, part of the course, or a major angle of the course, is mainly when we study, you know, colonial literature, what is fictional about it? What is fiction? Because sometimes you have historical accounts, and one might protest and say, okay, give me a break. Like, this is like mere history. But again, historical, you know, we don't have to take it for granted that history is history or fiction is fiction. Sometimes they conflate, they overlap, and, you know, in history you can find literature because the way you view the others is fictional itself. The way you talk about the land is fictional. The way you give your point of view is fictional. So there is nothing. These, you know, it's an angle we should concentrate on, the fictionality or the fictional elements in any work of art we are going to study. John Cotton's was one of, you know, the ministers, you know, who got, you know, God's promise to his plantation. It is a sermon. You have also, you know, Cotton Mather, Thomas Hooker, you know. Those were, you know, very notable, you know, writers. But as you see, they were religious writers. And those people were very influential because when they were writing sermons or when they were speaking sermons, they were using allegorical style. They were very didactic, you know.
Yeah. And the educated people helped them to
live, you know,
yes,
righteous
and to say
life.
their words in
Yeah,
an
they were mainly didactic, you know. They were encouraging the colonial project. Jonathan Edwards, like towards the end, like, and this is, you know, perhaps, I mean, a text which, let's say, made a crack in Puritanism and led to the disintegration because it has emotional appeal towards reform. and Jonathan Edwards. You know, this is very, I wish we had time to study this. You know, it's like a sermon, sinners in the hands of an angry God. You know, it's a very powerful sermon, you know, and it was very influential in making the awakening itself. The histories, they were histories, and one of the histories was written by William Bradford, Plymouth Plantation. Okay, all of those are literary pieces, you know, like they are anthologized in in the Heath Anthology of American Literature as literary things. Even as I told you, the Declaration of Independence, it is like a literary document. Cotton Mothers, Magnolia, and Christa America, you know, they are all these poetry. Okay, poetry was there, and the major poets were Anne Bradstreet, which we are going to start, you know, coming Tuesday. So the presenter should prepare themselves because we don't have to continue lagging behind. It's enough to have this introductory at this period. Taylor, you know, one of you know, the Puritans who wrote poetry. He was influenced by metaphysical poets, you know, John Donne, Andrew Marvell, and others. You know, Wigglesworth, The Day of Doomsday, the first American poem. It's about 2,500 lines, you know. And you know, this one was famous. They were chanting, you know, it was given for school children, and you know, it was like something like beading. It's a religious, you know, it's like a prayer. And Anne Bradstreet said, like, you know, my children had to scent their mouth before they go to sleep by chanting some of this. You know, in previous years, I was teaching parts of, you know, the Doomsday. It is, you know, the Doomsday, in fact, is, you know, a typical articulation of the Puritans' Calvinistic beliefs. So it shows how, you know, it portrays the Doomsday, how people are elected for, you know, heaven, and how some people are elected, and some children who are crying, we have no, it is not us, it is he who committed the sin. So why should we bear the sin of somebody? So it's very interesting, you know, reading, I mean, the poem, but unfortunately we are not going to read. Anne Bradstreet, you know, a privileged, a franchised woman, you know, she was close to the, you know, the governors, and, you know, she was a very effective writer. She had, you know, a volume called The 10th Muse, okay? Edward Taylor, like, had a lot of preparatory meditations, and we are going to study some of his poetry. We're studying, you know, him because, you know, you find transcendentalism, like transcendentalist point of views, self-searching, loneliness, all the, you know, later, you know, characteristics are there in the poetry and in the art of these writers. Biographies, like, you know, the major biographers of Colonel were Increase Mather, Cotton Mather, and Ebsner Troll. Drama was not, you know, that great, but, you know, they were drama, I mean, because the Puritans in the North, they did not allow drama. It was forbidden, you know, because they thought drama was corrupted. And perhaps you know, that's why the theater was closed during, you know, the revolution in England. You know? So because they thought that drama was spoiling, you know. However, yes, in America, I mean, wrote plays near, you know, Thomas Godfrey and Mercy Otis Warren, you know, they were, you know, writers. They composed, but they were not like very, you know, artistic plays. So they don't have, you know, they had to wait until, you know, 19th century. We have like what we call drama. The belletrist essays, you know, they were there, and there were many writers like Dogwood Papers, like, you know, I mean, Benjamin Franklin, you know, was writing, you know, Benjamin Franklin, who wrote biography called Benjamin Franklin. It is very, interesting. And if you read Benjamin Franklin, you learn, an American value which is self-reliance. Self-reliance, man is self-made. Self-reliance is, a distinctive feature of American value. If you read like, Stopping by the Wood and two words, diverged, so the traveler is going to take one, the less trodden one, the less trodden path. Why? Because this is typically American. We, don't want to imitate. We want our own literature. We want our own identity. So the search of identity was there in, the early colonial literature, and it continued. This urge, because, we are talking about a nation which was, forming itself, without a definite identity. The first, they were identified themselves by, the countries they came from, but later they had to identify themselves by the land they were living on, and it was not easy for them to acquire that identity. So the search of identity was very, laborious search. It was not easy. It was full. I mean, this is the quest of identity. The quest of identity is a major motif in American. It was like the motif of the American dream. So you see, all these factors made us look at these, because without, understanding the historical, the social context, it would be very, difficult to evaluate such type of literature. Okay, we have political essayist, okay. Yes, Dickinson's letters, Thomas Paine, John Dickinson's. Thomas Paine was writing letters before the revolutionary letters. And these letters were preparing the nation for the revolution against, England, the empire. Key historical events, I want to end perhaps by these, the historical events, in the period, an event with enormous repercussions. What was that? It was, when slaves were brought to Jamestown in 1619. So it was early, like slavery accompanied, the colonization itself. So you have slavery, you have indigenous people, These people were sometimes demonized, and later when we discuss 19th century American Gothic tradition, we're going to see that those people who were demonized, they are going to replace the ghost, because, the American culture do not have ghosts. So they are going, to replace, ghosts by those, demonized people. The issue of slavery, which, divided the nation, and perhaps, it was the cause of the Civil War. If you remember, in the during Abraham Lincoln, was very irksome to the American policy makers, and it continued to be a dividing factor even until today. Even after the complete emancipation, there is still a rift in the nation because of the issue of slavery. Okay, the landing and the establishment and development of Plymouth by the Pilgrims. This is very important. The landing of the the Pilgrims and of Plymouth, and the celebration of the first Thanksgiving, because they survived, famine, and the Thanksgiving, which is now celebrated the last Thursday, November every year. So it was first celebrated by the Plymouth, inhabitants. What else? The beginning of the great migration of Puritans to America, John Winthrop, with 3,000 people who came. And it should be very important that all those people were educated. A lot of them were university graduates. They were not just immigrants. They were not thieves. They were educated people. They escaped the wrath of the king, in order to worship God as they wanted to worship. This, Bay Colony later merged, this, with Plymouth to form the largest Bay Colony in Massachusetts, later which was in Boston. Okay. We're talking about what events.
Yeah, so you
Yes. We're talking about George Walfield, an English evangelist. Is it like this one? Yes. John Cotton and Roger Williams disagreed on the issue of freedom of conscience. For example, William embraced, but Cotton did not. There was like an argument, a kind of argument among the Puritans. The issue openly in a series of publications. So the issue of personal freedom started to surface, the debate, the public debate, the social debate, and of course, as we said, these factors were detrimental in, let's say, disintegrating that Puritan grip. There was also the trial of the witches. It was in this period the trial of witches, and I would say I skipped also the war, the King Philip War. King Philip War, like it was a war between the indigenous people and the English colonists, and it lasted for 3 years. During this period, Mary Rowlandson was taken as a captive, and we are studying her captivity, in this course. Hawthorne, was, wrote about the Puritans, wrote about, the witch trials, and his writing is a kind of confessional writing. The famous, novel, The Scarlet Letter, which is, the first romance, fiction, is a kind of confession in which he was criticizing those intolerant people, and in which he was contrasting nature, with, man, with, man, nature, which was, transcendentalist, and man, which was full of evil. I mean, man who has a free will. But the Puritans were devilish, He was criticizing them. The middle of the 18th century, religion, there were certain transformation, certain changes, and, as we said, the whole thing started to deliberate. Now, the coming of Whitefield, an English, evangelist who arrived in America, changed many things. He started to, promote, change, promote freedom, and he urged those people to change. So soon after, and this led to listening of, the Puritans' grip, and, Puritanism by that time, started to lose, and, the Parliament, started to give more space for personal freedom. So Puritanism, as a religious and the state movement, started to fade away. All of these, you can refer to them in, the reading. Foreign influence, I'm sorry, this is, of course, those writers, came educated. So whenever they, came, they imitated it. So we are talking about, the Bible, if you remember, we are talking about, the English, the French, the Renaissance, Shakespeare. So all of these writings, influenced them.
Or imitated.
And, they imitated, and sometimes they created their own. So I thought by this, and the audience, of course, they were the Puritans themselves, and the immigrants who were dreaming of coming to America. I thought this quick and even lengthy, presentation would give you an insight into the forming of a nation, and would prepare you for, the beginning of the course. So we are skipping the other 50 pages. We'll delay them, and next time we're going to see, Anne Bradstreet. So everybody should prepare Anne Bradstreet, we're studying two poems, the prologue and, you know, My Dear Loving Husband. Okay? So we should focus on, you know, what is American and what is non-American. Okay? Like this would be, you know, the angle we should focus every time we are approaching, you know, colonial texts. We're not studying many texts in the colonial period. We're studying few texts in order to, like, to build, you know, like to have some solid background where we can evaluate 19th and 20th century American literature. Okay, do you have any question before we finish? Are you worried?
Thank you.
Don't worry, like this is like historical background. Are you okay?
Yes.
Okay, are you ready to read next time?
Yes.
Who's presenting? Okay, and all of you are supposed to, three of you are presenting? Okay. So yeah, and the other people should prepare, should be full participant. Now, this class is easy to know who's participating or not, because when I give you marks, I look. You know, Taqreeb did participate how many times? I'll put for her marks. You know, you know, Amani, how many times? Amani, Halak, you know, I should like put marks according. I'm sorry, you are there, okay? So you cannot wriggle out. And you cannot say, I participated, doctor. You know?
Yeah.
Don't worry. Inshallah, all of you will pass the course. بس أهم حاجة ابعدوا عن البلاgiarism في الريسيرش. Last year it was a catastrophe for those who plagiarized. About 8 people or 9 did not succeed because of plagiarism.